Her publication, Race and National Security, will be forthcoming with Oxford University Press in 2023. Professor Sirleaf has received a number of prestigious awards, grants, fellowships, and other honors. These include the University of Pittsburgh Chancellor's Distinguished Research Award in 2019, the American Society of Law, Medicine, and Ethics Health Law Scholar Selection in 2019, the New York University Martin Luther King Jr. Humanitarian Award in 2014, and a Fulbright Fellowship in 2004. A graduate of Yale Law School, the University of Ghana Legan Center for International Affairs, and the New York University College of Arts and Sciences, Professor Sirleaf has served in a number of attorney and fellow roles prior to entering academia. Please welcome Matiange Sirleaf to the stage.
Thank you for that generous introduction. I am so thrilled to be here before you today, speaking on a topic that is near and dear to my heart. And I understand that the conversations this morning were already generative at the keynote and at the breakout session. And so I hope to continue that conversation with you here. Today, I'm going to be talking with you about white health as global health. And I want to start by thinking about a conversation that took place between two French doctors who were appearing on public television, and they were discussing the potential of utilizing African subjects in experimental trials for a tuberculosis vaccine as an antidote to the novel coronavirus. And as you can see on the screen, one of the doctors talked about the utility of using African subjects as subjects in this potential trial and compared this to how in the past there were a turn to use prostitutes when there was studies being done on AIDS because they are exposed and they don't protect themselves. And the other doctor responds in the affirmative that this is a phenomenal idea, and I think that we should study this and draft a call for tenders and the like. And so the fallout from this conversation was stark. The Director General of the World Health Organization denounced these kinds of racist remarks as sort of a hangover of colonial mentality. He maintained at the time that Africa can't and won't be a testing ground for any vaccine. Unsurprisingly, the fallout on the social media was also swift. Samuel Eto'o from Cameroon, he's actually a football legend, referred to the doctors as des assassins. Several others questioned the motives of the doctors and questioned the utility of testing a vaccine on the African continent. And so I want to use this conversation as an entry point for thinking about a number of things, right? So why were there such visceral and strong reactions? And how do we think about the underlying racism and neocolonialism in some of the comments that were sort of reflexively invoked? And how does this inform our understanding of global health law? And so what I would like to do in this talk with you this afternoon is think about connecting the racial and colonial logics that underpin global health law and policy, and interrogate to what extent we see some of the past reflected in current lawmaking and policy, and what the opportunities are for challenging this past. So to begin, I will talk about the path of sort of racialized medicine and the path of tropical and colonial medicine as it was practiced, and how that influenced the birth of sort of international health, and then talk about the emergence of the global health regime. And what I want to put forward is the ways in which a prioritization of white health was an animating purpose behind the emergence of the global health regime. And I want to connect the persistence of coloniality in global health and think about what it would mean to render race visible in global health, and how do we assess current legal reform efforts given this history. So first, let's think about the ways in which subordination is manifested in tropical medicine. And tropical medicine is connected to the ways in which racialized states developed public health systems. And so let's spend some time thinking about efforts that were aimed at improving the health of subordinated populations within the realm of public health. And these efforts tended to be explicitly linked to racial capitalism, meaning where there was a sense that it would be beneficial to the health of white majoritarian interests, then there were public health interventions that were made. And so this connection of using people of color sort of as being valuable based not on their value intrinsically, but on their value to others, is a functional relationship that I want us to interrogate. And this quote here from Huey Long, who's a Louisianan senator at the time, talks about this and put this sort of in really stark terms. And so there's a way in which there's an interest convergence on thinking about the health of historically subordinated groups as it relates to the health of those who possess positions of privilege and power. And so there's a way in which states develop public health systems to improve the health of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color as scientific knowledge expands to confirm that germs really don't know any color line, right? And so disease-carrying microorganisms are not using segregationist logic. They're not differentiating amongst their victims based on skin color and the like. And so there is a way in which there is a force pushing you to consider the health of historically marginalized groups. And so Jim Crow medicine and Jim Crow laws in the United States couldn't prevent germs, measles, tuberculosis, pneumonia, typhoid, and the like from spreading. And so this necessitates action that includes historically subordinated groups in public health interventions. If we think about another racialized state, for example, South Africa, concern for the health and well-being of Black people in South Africa was similarly driven primarily by proximity to the white population and the potential negative impact that this might have on white interests. And so, for example, leprosy was perceived to be a quote unquote Black disease, and harsh measures were enacted that allowed for compulsory segregation of all lepers due to fears that the disease was spreading and affecting white people. And so while Black lepers were detained on Robben Island, white lepers were allowed to remain quarantined at home. And so I want us to think about the ways in which interest convergence necessitates the inclusion of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in public health efforts domestically, and how we might see this mirrored at the global level. So thinking now about colonial medicine or tropical medicine and its role in this. So tropical medicine, as you likely know, was a crucial aspect of colonial subjugation and expansion. For example, French colonial authorities in Senegal used the bubonic plague to further segregationist ends by closely linking the Black population to the disease. Since they conceived of Black people as barbaric, and they fashioned public health measures to keep and segregate and separate out Black people in the city. And in previous work, I talk about how this sort of associating of people of color with particular diseases is based on stereotype and bias, right? So thinking of people of color as particularly afflicted with disease is a stereotype. That stereotype has crystallized and spread globally and is influential when we think about the role of scientific racism and others, because there is this sort of imbuing of scientific racism with objective validity, which legitimizes beliefs of racial superiority in ways that are quite problematic. And so this manifested in treating Black Africans, although they did not have an infection rate that was any higher than any racial group. French authorities imposed harsher measures on them in Senegal. This included the burning of huts, along with the formation of quarantine camps and the like, when a cordon sanitaire was put in place in 1914 during an outbreak that was taking place in Dakar. Similarly, British colonial authorities in Sierra Leone, their preferred method of fighting malaria was residential segregation. Several other analyses have pointed out how sanitation concerns were often used as pretext for furthering segregationist ends. And so tropical medicine took place in colonial settings and often depended on the coercive power of the colonial administrative state to implement its interventions. For instance, in 1905, the British Indian Plague Commission ran experiments wherein epidemiologists would release rats and guinea pigs into houses that were suspected of harboring the plague. They would return days later to retrieve them, but only if the animals proved to be infected did the officials remove the human inhabitants. Likewise, during the midst of the smallpox epidemic and influenza epidemic, British colonial authorities in Sierra Leone neglected the health needs of the population. So tropical medicine proved to be something that was generative for colonialism, because as advances in the field of tropical medicine took place, it furthered imperialist ends by enabling troops to better cope with unfamiliar diseases, to be able to be healthy and to be able to fight indigenous populations that were resisting colonial domination and subjugation. Unsurprisingly then, tropical medicine grew to specifically focus on vector-borne diseases and infectious disease control, since these diseases had the most implications for the expansion of colonial empires. So moving now from colonial medicine to global health, there was an effort by European imperial powers at the time to utilize international law, public international law, as a vehicle such that public health concerns became globalized. There was a sense that there was a need to cooperate amongst imperial powers for the treatment and prevention of diseases. And international law served as a vehicle for that cooperation. And in the first part of the 20th century, there were about 13 or so international agreements concerning a collaboration on health control measures. Negotiations to build the nascent global health regime even predated the 1884 Berlin Conference, wherein European imperial powers partitioned the African continent into territorial spheres of influence. Colonial powers prioritized global health because they wanted to coordinate their efforts around imposing sufficiently restrictive quarantine regulations, which would then facilitate unimpeded expansion of imperial trade and not expose their populations in the mother country to diseases from colonial territories. This prioritization of defensive measures against contagion from territories that were viewed as diseased when formulating the global health regime is reflected in historical documents. For instance, Adrien Proust, one of the leading French voices during the international sanitary conferences, authored several works on the defense of Europe from exotic diseases. The 1892 convention, for example, solely concerns cholera and sanitation measures aimed at stopping the westward spread of cholera, because there were concerns that it would enter the Suez Canal and be introduced into Europe from India. And so consequently, the 1893 convention required state parties to inform each other of any outbreaks of cholera within their territories. Similarly, when European powers had fear of a cholera epidemic in Mecca, impacting and touching upon their interests, because Muslim pilgrims were returning to Europe and they were viewed as a serious threat, the epidemic had claimed around 30,000 or so lives. The Sanitary Convention of 1894 then is thus singularly dedicated to the pilgrimage to Mecca and preventative measures mandated to try to stem that. Following an epidemic in India of the plague, we had Europeans were anxious about their other colonial territories being impacted. And so the International Sanitary Convention of 1897 added the plague as a disease warranting international prioritization and notification. So these treaties then exemplify how colonial powers are shaping what is important on the global health agenda. And so the elevation of a particular disease in the global health arena is tied to the concern or interest that that particular disease has on those with power and privilege. This is reflected also in the 1926 convention, which modified the 1912 convention and required international notification for the first confirmed cases of cholera, plague, yellow fever, as well as smallpox and typhus. Notably, at that time, there were millions of cases of typhus that had impacted Poland and Soviet Union following World War I. So again, this expansion of the list of diseases that deserve international recognition coincides with the increasing importance of these diseases in capitals in the global north. During the 1930s, we see a similar pattern when the Aedes aegypti mosquito was endemic in parts of southern Europe, and there were several outbreaks of dengue. 13 European countries agreed to prioritize the prevention and spread of dengue underneath the International Convention for Mutual Protection Against Dengue. This further indicates that the relevance or irrelevance of diseases depended on whether they converge with wide interest. It's not as if the diseases prioritized by the sanitary conventions were the only diseases afflicting populations globally. The early global health regime exclusively focused on diseases that were seen as intersecting with the interest of the powerful. This continued into the League of Nations. Members of the new League of Nations endeavored to take steps in matters of international concern for the prevention and control of disease. Under the League, these efforts continued to reflect global health efforts that privileged the interest of white populations. This led to some commentators to conclude that as compared to what it has done for other parts of the world, the Health Committee of the League of Nations has done remarkably little for the African continent. It was not until we get to the 1944 modification of the International Sanitary Convention that the global health regime even began requiring state parties to send epidemiological information for diseases not already preordained as significant by capitals in the global north. Under the 1944 convention, state parties, so far as possible, were to send regular interval reports of notifications of communicable diseases in their countries. So after the 1944 convention, the 1969 convention is the next major sanitary regulation. The 1969 Health Assembly revised, consolidates, and renames the international sanitary regulations to be called the International Health Regulations. It still is only pertaining to cholera, to plague, and yellow fever. State sovereignty continues to be a paramount concern. There's not much scope for individual or human rights underneath this framework. The basic premise of the system remains the same as prior regulations, in that there are notification requirements for named infectious diseases. That's then going to trigger an international response. And that could mean the imposition of travel and trade restrictions and the like to contain the spread of diseases. From 1969, the next major set of revisions to the international health regulations takes place in 2005. But before we get to thinking about the current regulations, I want to talk a little bit about the World Health Organization. So unlike predecessor institutions, the World Health Organization was to be global, not just in name, but also in substance. Its constitution states that the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health is one of the fundamental rights of every human being, without distinction of race, religion, political belief, economic, or social condition. The World Health Organization was founded on the principle that the health of all peoples is fundamental to the attainment of peace and security and is dependent upon the fullest cooperation of individuals and states. This is profound because the World Health Constitution is one of the first treaties that we sort of see health as a human right being prioritized in a sort of hard body of law. It also the World Health Organization is also founded on the belief that the extension to all peoples of the benefit of medical, psychological, and related knowledge is essential to the full attainment of health. These founding principles of the World Health Organization will continue to be tested as the organization moves and deals with different challenges, from SARS to HIV and AIDS to currently dealing with where we are now, the COVID-19 pandemic. Returning to the international health regulations, one of the things that's significant in the international health regulations of 2005 is that there is not a sort of disease list from the past that we've been talking about. There is this sort of all hazards approach. And there is an expansion of who's allowed to notify of any outbreak, which includes NGO actors. But one of the things that remains in the international health regulations of 2005 is the sort of backgrounding of race. There's a way in which the regulations' failure to recognize historic and ongoing racial discrimination in public health and in medicine is maintained. And this failure to engage with race obscures the role of racism and subordination in global health. And so one of the ways in which this is problematic is that this then backgrounds structural conditions in the international system that give rise to and limit the ability of states to develop core capacities. The regulations assign primary responsibility for implementing health measures to combat infectious diseases to national authorities and component parts. Under the regulations, state parties have a legal obligation to develop better functioning systems, health systems that are supposed to detect disease, surveil, report, verify, and respond. State parties are also legally obligated to cooperate to help build health capacities, but the regulations are silent on how this is actually supposed to happen. So it doesn't articulate how this should be operationalized. And what this means then is that the history of subordination and dynamics in the world that have rendered states vulnerable to epidemic and pandemic diseases continue to be invisibilized and unaccounted for. One of the benefits of the international health regulations is that there is, within the regulations, a recognition of human rights obligations. So prior to this, all of the sanitary conventions that I've been referencing and the other international health regulations that existed before don't really engage with human rights in any significant way. The international health regulations of 2005 are to be commended for recognizing human rights. And it says that the UN Charter and its recognition of human rights is to be implemented with full respect for dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms of persons. That's including where there is a public health emergency of international concern that has been declared. This is something that is significant and is something that was tested and continues to be tested during the COVID-19 pandemic. So enter COVID, and I want us to think about the ways in which the current system provides an opportunity for states to make choices based on either implicit or explicit racism. So if we think about the COVID-19 pandemic, we can reflect on the ways in which states made decisions that were informed by outdated but persistent settler colonial conventions that have mapped illness and disease onto racialized peoples and certain geographic regions. The World Health declared COVID-19 a public health emergency of international concern on January 30th, 2020. It has consistently advised against the application of travel or trade restrictions to countries that are experiencing COVID-19 outbreaks. However, by February 27th, 2020, 38 countries had already reported measures that significantly interfere with international traffic in relation to travel to and from China or other countries, ranging from the denial of entry of passengers, visa restrictions, or quarantine for returning travelers. The understanding of the disease as racialized and foreign constrained the space initially for consideration of community transmission within the United States. This understanding of the disease continues to influence US policymaking in this space. Most recently, the Biden administration put in place a negative testing requirement from individuals traveling from China. And thinking about this from a public health perspective, there's nothing wrong, obviously, with a negative test requirement to travel for COVID-19, but singling out a particular nationality is not an effective public health strategy. You would think that you would do this requirement for all travel domestically, all travel internationally, if you're really thinking about stopping the spread of COVID-19. Instead, what we've seen is an over-reliance on blanket travel bans as sort of a magical solution to stop the spread of a highly infectious disease, concomitant also with a lackadaisical approach to implementing screening measures at airports in the United States and elsewhere. This indicates how the racialization of COVID-19 has led to ineffective public health law and policy decisions, ways in which decisions that sort of assume that the virus is engaged in racialized border control efforts, checking documents and nationalities to determine who to infect next. We can even reflect back on one newspaper in France, which carried the headline "Yellow Alert" on its front pages. Now, these early efforts were not merely ones at disease containment. Indeed, the racial and colonial logics of COVID-19 law and policymaking was evident in innumerable ways throughout the course of the pandemic. Another example, more recently, is the swift decision by countries in the global north to cut off Southern African countries following South Africa's genomic sequencing of the Omicron variant. Instead of being rewarded for tracing and alerting the world to a variant that was already circulating in Europe, the United Kingdom, the United States, the European Union, and others were hasty to make decisions informed by Afrophobia, as the president of Malawi aptly termed it. One newspaper literally published a depiction of racialization of diseases, replete with brown viruses with stereotypical, phenotypical Black features traveling on a boat with the South African flag towards European shores. The Ebola epidemic had also resuscitated historical images of Black African bodies as uncontainable, as disease-ridden, and had sparked racialized fears. The fear of the racialized other and diseases reminds us quite powerfully about how the history of diseases and response to diseases is linked to politics of racial exclusion and racial subordination. And I think this is a good time for us to think about the ways in which the persistence of coloniality manifest in global health. Colonial mentality continues to influence the underlying assumptions and structuring of interventions in a number of global health law and policies. This is reflected in tendencies of white saviorism, which can reflect the white man's burden to save supposedly uncivilized, ignorant, and diseased natives from themselves. For example, Renee Bach, here pictured, a 20-year-old high school graduate from Virginia with no medical training, took it upon herself to establish and run a center for severely malnourished children in Uganda, wherein 105 of the 940 under the center's care died. Her decision to found this center came from a volunteer missionary trip where she had a very, very profound feeling and experience and felt that there was something that she was supposed to do. The audaciousness and experimental nature of her actions, which resulted in death to already vulnerable children, is intrinsically linked to long histories of drop-in missionary trips and white saviorism in colonial medicine. Her actions also reflect an unspoken assumption in global health that whatever is one's qualification, they must be more than the indigenous population. Moreover, Box Rouge was able to continue for 5 years, in part because of the longstanding practice of short-term medical mission trips and aid organizations that routinely parachute doctors in and out of countries in the global South. The legacy of inequity in global health is such that even if you have never worked in global health, the color of your skin and the accent of your voice may unduly confer upon you qualifications and a level of authority that you likely do not deserve and should not have. Moreover, global health, like colonial medicine before it, continues to displace and supplant local systems of knowledge, production, and focuses on biomedical once-off solutions. These approaches prioritize quick fixes as opposed to structural approaches that would require addressing the social determinants of health. We also see a recurrence of the prioritization of certain diseases as important and being elevated in global health, which tends to mean that a more horizontal based approaches at building up health systems isn't prioritized, and there are donor-driven top-down interventions, which perhaps from the donor's perspective can be more easily measured, but from the country's perspective, don't necessarily coincide with building up a robust public health system that can respond to a number of ailments. So the current tendency also in global health to emphasize individual responsibility harkens back to a colonial discourse and rhetoric that tended to blame natives for their ailments, as opposed to inequitable resource distribution, for example. Such ahistorical accounts surfaced during the Ebola epidemic and tended to blame marginalized populations for being non-compliant and facilitating the spread of disease in ways that obscure geopolitical and structural factors that facilitate disease transmission. We have seen this with HIV and AIDS, and we've also seen this during the COVID-19 pandemic. Contemporary global health interventions continue to reflect the top-down dynamics of colonial approaches to tropical medicine that I was just referring to. And this includes not consulting with local communities and partnerships that involve really imbalanced power relationships in terms of funding and influence between countries that and researchers that are located in the global north, pairing and partnering with those located in the global south. Moreover, such partnerships can often be skewed in ways in which the distribution of benefits are not equally allocated. And so global health cannot and shouldn't be divorced or decontextualized or depoliticized from its historical roots and governing logics, because it's important to interrogate the ways in which these governing logics continue to manifest and show up in global health law and policymaking today. One area that I wanted to turn our attention to is medical experimentation and the use of people of color in clinical trials and the ways in which history can't be ignored here. And to do that, I want to introduce a concept called medical neocolonialism, because that concept sort of aptly characterizes a pattern of extraction of resources from Black and other people of color, wherein the knowledge generated from research is subsequently taken for the development of new treatment and drugs. However, the subjects of their research and their communities generally do not share equitably in the benefits of new drugs or treatments. And this concept draws on a number of the characteristics of historical colonialism, in that medical neocolonialism is driven by economic dependence, by exploitation, by inequality, and treating communities of color as disposable. This sordid history of human experimentation, I'm sure you are well aware of, the ways in which For example, J. Marion Sims conducted unanesthetized fistula surgeries on enslaved Black women. The Tuskegee syphilis experiments based on which failed to treat and misled 600 Black men. There's a continued belief that Black people have a high tolerance for pain, which has informed some of these studies, to the ways in which clinical trials take place today, and which I want to highlight because this isn't sort of just a historical matter. There's ongoing ways in which medical experimentation takes place in ways that subordinate people of color. For example, in 1996, during the worst ever meningitis outbreak in the African continent, Pfizer conducted a clinical trial in which 100 children in Nigeria were given an experimental oral antibiotic, while an additional 100 received another antibiotic. Reportedly, 5 children died on the former and 6 on the latter. Some children allegedly received a dose lower than what was recommended, leaving many children with brain damage, paralysis, slurred speech, and there was a lawsuit as a result of this against Pfizer for failing to obtain informed consent. Pfizer eventually settled this suit with the drug trial victims after a protracted 15-year-long legal battle. Additionally, you may be familiar with research done early during the AIDS pandemic that was conducted in Uganda for an AIDS vaccine, which was designed to test the safety of HIV subtype B, which is the type that's prevalent in Europe and the Americas. HIV, as you may know, has 11 major subtypes, which correspond with geographical range. Subtype D is the dominant one in East Africa. So the research being done in Uganda tested a vaccine designed to attack a virus not prevalent in Uganda. Another problematic trial that took place with Boehringer Ingelheim in Uganda involved tens of thousands of severe adverse effects for women who were taking anti-HIV transmission drug nevirapine in between 1997 and 2003. Their symptoms went unreported, testing continued, and 14 women died. During the 2014 to 2016 Ebola outbreak, an Italian NGO tested a heart drug, imidazole, on Ebola patients at a treatment facility in Sierra Leone. The drug is not among the 53 drugs listed to have any antiviral effect on Ebola. Some British medics working at the center concluded that the side effects from the drug could have contributed to increased morbidity within the center. And certain medical staff staged a protest and walked out of the facility to protest the use of this drug outside of a clinical trial, concomitant with the lack of an informed consent obtained from patients. Some researchers also took thousands of blood samples from Ebola patients during the 2014 to 2016 epidemic and now hold these samples in secretive laboratories around the world. Ebola survivors did not consent for their blood to be taken, and several African scientists have accused the laboratories of biological asset stripping, as they are unable to access the samples for their own research, despite African health practitioners taking all of the risk in drawing the blood. These incidents indicate the limitations of the World Medical Association's Declaration of Helsinki and the World Health Organization's Handbook for Good Clinical Research Practice and their ability to protect historically subordinated groups and their rights. Moreover, even where there is adequate legal and regulatory framework that exists on paper, the de facto policy of treating Black, Indigenous, and other people of color as expendable requires far more robust mechanisms to counteract this practice of dehumanization in reality. This history then surfaces with COVID-19 when you come to thinking about where we started today's conversation, where you saw resistance from a number of groups in a number of areas to signing up for COVID-19 vaccines. There was skepticism that COVID-19 vaccines would be used to help historically subordinated groups, since these groups have not experienced sort of public health and global health interventions as sort of salutatory in the past. So when the University of Oxford announced that it was going to begin a new trial of its COVID-19 vaccine in Johannesburg, you see the protesters here in June of 2020 challenging the trials as exploitative and resisting introduction of the trials in South Africa. In response, many focused on the necessity of diversity in trials in ways that can actually problematically reify biological understandings of race. Others dismiss the fears and concerns as sort of irrational in the face of a public health emergency. But this resistance is important to contextualize against this history of past and ongoing experience with systemic racism in public health and medicine. And so I turn now to where we sit today during the COVID-19 pandemic, which I think is an opportunity for us to recognize and potentially reshape the relationship between race and global health. Unfortunately, some of the proposed amendments to the international health regulations that have surfaced from the United States and from other countries tend to sort of narrowly focus on bolstering early detection efforts without sufficient attention to dealing with historical vulnerabilities of health systems and the need to build capacity. In earlier work, I have talked about the importance of a common but differentiated responsibility and using that principle in global health to deal with the challenges posed by highly infectious diseases. Briefly, the two main aspects of the principle is one, that there should be a common responsibility, which describes the shared nature of obligations of two or more states towards a shared resource, and that there's a range of different burden sharing arrangements that take into account each nation's range of particular circumstances, especially as it relates to its ability to prevent, reduce, and control a problem, here, a pandemic. Encouragingly, the World Health Organization's conceptual zero draft that was released in February of 2023 embraces this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and capabilities in pandemic prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery of health systems. The zero draft clarifies that states that hold more resources relevant to pandemics, including pandemic-related products and manufacturing capacity, should bear, where appropriate, a commensurate degree of differentiated responsibility. It stipulates that prioritization is required of the specific needs and special circumstances of developing countries, and that parties, especially those that are particularly vulnerable to adverse effects of pandemics, do not have adequate capacities to respond to pandemics and potentially bear a disproportionate high burden. If operationalized, this principle could help address some of the issues of racialized structural inequities that I've been talking about in this talk in ways that current frameworks do not. The zero draft embraces other principles that would help to address this legacy of past and continuing racism in global public health, including equity, solidarity, and inclusiveness. Notably, the zero draft recognizes the principle that non-discrimination means that all individuals should have fair, equitable, and timely access to pandemic response products and health services without fear of discrimination or distinction based on race, religion, political belief, economic, or social condition. Beyond a statement of principles, there are substantive provisions within the zero draft aimed at addressing access to technology, promoting sustainable and equitably distributed production and transfer of technology and know-how, increasing research and development capacities, fair, equitable, and timely sharing of benefits, strengthening and sustaining preparedness and health systems resilience, strengthening and sustaining a skilled and competent health workforce, and sustainable and predictable financing, amongst others. It remains to be seen how transformational the final text of the treaty is going to be, and whether, once adopted, it's in practice will contribute towards anti-subordination efforts. My hope is that burgeoning efforts to decolonize global public health and to address racial inequities will not be ephemeral. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Hello, everyone. Well, thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Professor Sirleaf, for this wonderful and very thought-provoking conversation. As you are formulating your questions and you want to submit a question up for the panel, just open your program. There's a little QR code here right on the first page, and you can scan that and submit a question. My name is Caitlin Williams. I'm a sixth-year doctoral candidate in the Maternal and Child Health Department. It is absolutely a pleasure to be here at the 44th Annual Minority Health Conference back here in person with y'all. It is really wonderful to be here. And so let's get this thing started.
All right, thanks, Caitlin. Can you all hear me? I'm very nervous, but I'm glad you're all here and you're engaging in these conversations. My name is Senna. I'm a first-year MPH student in global health. I'm from Ghana. This is very dear to me. Thank you very much for how bold you are for having these honest conversations with us. And I'm really glad to have you all here as well. So Professor Sirleaf, thank you again for your remarks on how COVID has continued to expose structural violence, especially through vaccine inequity. I think everybody here can agree that global health has been for a very long time grounded in how can we save the lives of how can we save ourselves from the lives of, how can we save ourselves from the disease other, rather than how can we save everyone? So could you comment on how global public health law has addressed these challenges, and also how we as practitioners, as students, can recenter global health for everyone?
So that's another lecture, but okay. But thank you for that. So one of the biggest challenges that we're sitting with today, right, is and where we sit and thinking about our positionality is important. We sit in a country that has a surplus of vaccines. We sit in a country that has hoarded vaccines. We sit in contrast to other places that have not even completed, the 2 doses of an mRNA vaccine, let alone onto booster doses. And so it's important to reflect on sort of our own positionality within this country as it relates to vaccine inequity, and thinking about the ways in which our current system has been an abysmal failure, if we're being honest, because what has happened is instead of sort of thinking about this pandemic as an opportunity for us to realize the ways in which we're all connected and how our health is connected to the health of others elsewhere, and how our ability to protect ourselves is connected to how robust vaccination programs are in other parts of the world, we have instead, and not just the United States, but the United States is a good example since we're sitting here, Canada and other countries have done this as well, have prioritized sort of stockpiling of vaccines that have even expired, and have done so at the exclusion of thinking about what it would mean to have a robust vaccine program elsewhere. And that has rendered us vulnerable, right? That's a very short-sighted vaccination policy that this country and others have adopted, because that has meant that where there are vaccination programs with incomplete or not even close to total coverage of a population, there is the opportunity for the mutation of a bunch of different variants, which is why we continue to sit, which is one of the reasons why we continue to sit in, what number variant are we on right now with the Omicron variant. And so not only has sort of self-interest been short-sighted and misguided, it has also rendered us not in a better position than we once were. And I think that one of the challenges that vaccine inequity has shown us is that the model of sort of donation-based, sort of altruistic, depending on the goodwill of other countries to sort of step in and fill in the gap, is simply just not enough. If this moment, sitting during this pandemic, was not enough to sort of galvanize us to recognize the ways in which we are all connected, then you know, I think it's disheartening because you would have hoped that programs like COVAX, which was the World Health Organization's main vehicle for distributing vaccines to low and middle income countries, which depended on supplies being donated from countries as well as money being donated. That vehicle was under-resourced throughout the course of the pandemic. And that has meant that countries that were reliant on COVAX were not really able to plan a fulsome vaccination policy for their countries. And that has meant that we are sitting in the result of that, which is that COVID, despite you know, the desire to declare it over, is not over. It continues to morph. It continues to impact all of us, not just in terms of death, but also in terms of all of the effects of long COVID, which are still being discovered. And so the quality of life of all of us has been rendered more insecure. Life expectancy in this country has reduced during COVID, because of COVID. And that short-sightedness, I think, is something that I would have hoped for better. And so the vaccine inequity that we have allowed to persist has only rendered our own existence, I think, more threatened. Yeah. So I could go on, but let me just stop there so that we can have other questions.
Did I turn this thing back off? Okay. Well, I really appreciate you bringing up, you know, kind of the long ongoing implications of COVID, particularly since we are still in the pandemic. I know, you know, for locally, there was an article in the News and Observer earlier this week that 12% of North Carolina's population is currently living with long COVID, that we have kind of diagnosed people living with long COVID, right? That doesn't include everybody that we haven't diagnosed, right? So this is a really persistent problem. But I want to come back to something that you just talked about with, you know, things like COVAX, right? That we've had in response to the pandemic, a lot of the infrastructure that we have within global health to respond is voluntary, right? And with this pandemic treaty that you talked about, right, we have the opportunity for the first time to really have something that's going to be binding, that's got some teeth. And so you talked a little bit about some of the principles that are in the zero draft, but, you know, you did say, like, look, we don't know what's going to come out, right? But I think if you were to think about, you know, I don't know, the top three, the top five, like these are the things that you think could really shift some of the power dynamics that we have at play. Like, what would be those things that you would really want to see come out of this pandemic treaty?
Sure. So, I mean, I alluded to one of them already in terms of thinking about how we differentiate responsibility and operationalizing what it means to help health systems build capacity, like to actually have some legal obligations around that. But I want to step back a little bit even further to think about contextualizing current reform efforts. So there are two parallel efforts that are not necessarily coordinated. One is revising the international health regulations, which we spent a lot of time on in the lecture. And so my fear is that efforts to revise the international health regulations will attract much of the political attention and attention of the powerful, and that reform process will be limited to those situated in the global South, and others need to be better at sort of reporting out when there's an outbreak threat. And that'll be the extent of the reforms, and there won't be anything that sort of really deals with some of the historical nature of vulnerabilities and the need to build up capacities. So one thing that could happen is that all of the prioritization is on making very narrow reforms to the international health regulations. And to the extent that the pandemic preparedness treaty gets adopted and it includes all of these different principles, that is a new treaty. That treaty is not binding on anybody. Not everybody has to sign that. And so even if that document is sort of expansive in terms of what the legal obligations are that states have to do in terms of helping to build capacity, in terms of burden sharing and the like, international law functions in a way that is consent-based. And so there's no requirement that a state join that particular regime. And so my fear then is that for all the promise that the pandemic treaty might present, the powerful might not sign on to that particular regime. We'll be left with the international health regulations sort of tinkered with at the margins, which is really about sort of increasing surveillance and doesn't address sort of some of the underlying fundamental issues and problems that we've witnessed with COVID, but with other areas in global health.
Thank you for that. So Professor Sirleaf, if we go back to your comment on effective altruism and how low and lower middle income countries have been dependent on altruism from high income countries, what policies or practices do you think LMICs have to enact to shift away from this dependency, or is it their responsibility?
Sure. So one, effective altruism, I think is like a very loaded term now to be using with SBF and others. So I definitely didn't say effective altruism, but the idea I hear what you're saying is one of, you know, philanthropy is not going to save us, right? And I think that there is a recognition of that in this current moment, right? So for example, South Africa and India were very instrumental in putting forward a waiver of intellectual property for that would apply to COVID-19 therapeutics, diagnostics, and vaccines to deal with to help low and middle income countries be able to produce and distribute therapeutics, diagnostics, and the like within their own countries, or at least be able to do some more South-South cooperation and to try to not be dependent on handouts. Because first of all, to be clear, it's not as if any one country wants to be dependent on the precarity of donors' sort of interest, because you can't do any effective planning that way, let alone a vaccine strategy that way. And so what they did during the pandemic was put forward a really important proposal that was aimed at challenging the intellectual property regime, at least with respect to COVID-19. And the result of that was not what they had initially hoped for, which was a waiver of intellectual property as it relates to COVID-19 diagnostics and therapeutics and the like. What they ended up getting was something much watered down. But I think that there is a recognition, I say that in response to your question, that I think that there is a recognition that philanthropy isn't going to get us out of this position. And in fact, the representatives of South Africa said as much in their submission before the World Trade Organization, which that's another lecture as well. So I'm trying to I'm trying to confine the scope of my comments with respect to this. But yes, I mean, I think that I say briefly, I think that countries in the global south are well aware that donations is not a solution to this or many other problems. Yeah, thanks.
All right, so I'm going to shift us a little bit and ask for your professor hat now.
Okay.
And so since we're here kind of at the Minority Health Conference embedded at the Gilling School of Global Public Health, one of the questions that I have is, and coming from the audience is, what are the ways in which institutions like Gillings might start to shift some of the curriculum. Like, well, how do we need to be thinking about public health education differently if we want to start to challenge some of the ways, the coloniality that's embedded in the field, if we want to start to change some of these norms? Like, how do we start to do that?
Sure, that's a really great question. I mean, I think that one of the things that has to happen is, you know, a lot of fields are now having this sort of soul searching moment where they're attempting to decolonize particular fields, decolonize global health, decolonize so on and so forth. And one of the things that's important in terms of pedagogy is thinking about how we being professors sort of teach a subject and how we might sort of decontextualize, depoliticize topics in ways that sort of paper over a number of some of the things that I was highlighting in my lecture. And so I think part of it is a challenge to professors in this space to make sort of connections between you know, the practice of tropical and colonial medicine to the ways in which global public health might sort of reinforce some of those themes today. Also, I think students have and have had a big role in sort of pushing schools and faculty to make sure that they're addressing legacies which might continue to surface in teaching as well. And I think that there's a role for students to think about sort of organizing in the current moment. So for example, universities allied for essential medicines is something that I remember when I was going to school was really active in pushing and it had different chapters pushing for antiretrovirals. And similarly, for antiretrovirals to deal with HIV and AIDS pandemic. And similarly, not that pandemic has been addressed by any stretch of the imagination, but today, a similar push for the people's vaccine is something that students could be organizing for today in student organizations, and that has a material effect on people's, you know, lives around the world. So I think there's an opportunity through student organizations as well as through classroom discussions and changing of syllabi, changing of texts to change the way that we in global health approach the subject of global public health, and to do so with some humility. Yeah, thanks.
I think one of the ways that at least we're doing that here at Gillings really is the conversations we're having in classrooms concerning terms that are circulating in global health. Some of these being effective solutions, realistic, specifically cost effective. How have you seen this being used in addressing global health issues in low and middle income countries? And what would you say the way forward would be?
Sure. So I think one of the challenges of sort of cost-effective approaches in global public health, again, has been this, and which is tied to a history of, you know, focusing on a particular disease and intervening on that particular disease. And the idea is that, you know, if we can focus on sort of eradicating malaria, for example, or smallpox or what have you, then we have a measurable, right? We can say, you know, how many cases do we have of this particular thing? And there are ways in which donors and others are motivated by that, right? There's a concrete way of thinking about cost benefit in relation to that. But that kind of approach, which is sort of, again, just vector driven and specific to a particular disease, we might even think about the Global Fund on tuberculosis, malaria, and HIV and AIDS as an example of that kind of an approach, is a really limited approach to thinking about public health interventions, because there's no way to think about, say, for example, making an intervention in one space with respect to disease without thinking about what quality of care looks like, for example, across, you know, what are people's experience with when they interface with a health system. And that might not be like a measurable thing, a cost-effective thing, but it really impacts your experience with public health institutions when you interact with them? How are people experiencing biases when they interface with the medical system? Is that a cost-effective thing? Anyway, I say that to say, if we focus so much on cost and reducing costs, we might lose some qualities that we would think are important for public health and that need to be emphasized in public health, and that might actually be intangible, but have great meaning for how people's lived experience with a public health sector is, and are also important in terms of evaluating the effectiveness of any health intervention. So I say that to say, I think that there's an over emphasis on, how cost effective a particular health intervention is at the detriment of thinking about people's lived experiences with interfacing with the health system, which is something that is actually meaningful and we know impacts health outcomes as well. So it's not just a sort of touchy-feely thing, it actually matters for people's health.
Okay, so this is maybe a provocative question. But you've taken us very quickly through, some of the kind of racist colonial legacies of the field of global health, right? Tropical medicine, international health, global health, whatever you want to call it. And you've taken us through some of the limitations of the international human rights kind of infrastructure as it exists within global health governance, right? And obviously could be not just an entire lecture, but a whole class on each one of those, right? But given all of that, right, since 2020, we've had all of this talk and, a million articles have come out about the quote unquote decolonization of global health, right? Like, is that even possible? Or is this a moment where we really need to just kind of like tear these fields down to their foundations? Because, to paraphrase Audre Lorde, right, like the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. Like how do we start to, as a new generation, think about how we might do this differently?
No, that's a great question. And also another lecture. No, that's a great question. That's a great question. And I think that there's a way in which on one hand, you can think about has decolonization, whether it's global health, whether it's, international law, whether it's whatever, become so passé that it's divorced and devoid of meaning. Meaning that it's used as a sort of a catchphrase and a catch-all for a bunch of things, which are not necessarily the same to different people. And I think at base, your question is, can the field be divorced from its founding, right? Like, can you, if you do actually decolonize global health, like what is left, right? In other words, is what I read your question to mean. And the thing is, I think that it is important to engage in sort of productive conversations here and elsewhere to sort of radically imagine what the project of global public health could look like. We have an example from history of what the project of global public health has looked like, but what would it mean to actually dedicate space to thinking about radically imagining how we structure global public health and how we value or do not value local knowledge, and how we value sort of biomedical interventions as sort of quick fix things. And one of the things that I think the call to decolonize is good for, amongst others, is that it forces us to think about structures, and anything that focuses our attention on structures as opposed to sort of individual behaviors or individual interventions is something that is welcome, because anything that is hoping to sort of unpack the ways in which structures have reinforced, for example, subordination in history, is going to take a lot to undo and unpack. And so I think the task is not to reuse tools that have been problematic in the past, but is to use our and your imagination in school of thinking about, armed with the knowledge that you have, about how global public health has functioned in ways that are not necessarily emancipatory, to consider what an emancipatory global public health is. And if you don't have one, I think that also tells us something about the project of global public health as well. And so I think that there is something to be learned either way. And I think the future is bright for you and hopefully for us in this world, because you're sitting here thinking about ways in which we might imagine a more just world, and then imagine a more equitable world in which maybe global public health doesn't look like what it looked like in the past, but maybe that's actually a good thing, right? Maybe we don't actually want it to be reminiscent of some of the legacies and histories that we've talked about today. So yeah, thank you for that.
Professor Sirleaf, thank you so much for being here with us today and for sharing your thoughts and your wisdom. And thank you all for your wonderful questions. And we're looking forward to the rest of the breakout sessions.
Thank you all.
Oh, please wait. Oh, 1 second. Yeah. Please join us in thanking Matange Sirleaf one more time for sharing how we can alter our global health system to address racism in public health. Professor Sirleaf, please accept this small gift of our a token of our appreciation. Oh, thank you all. Thank you so much. Before the afternoon breakout sessions at 3:30, there is time to continue to engage with each other, visit exhibitor tables, and learn about the poster presenters. Also, please note that Cornell Wright will no longer be presenting. Instead, the ID Youth Council will be presenting in the Red Bud Room. The location of all these activities can be found in your conference program. Since the afternoon breakout session will conclude our actual conference, we would like to share a few final remarks real quick.
Thanks to each of you for your support and attendance today. Your passion for and commitment to minority health is an indispensable factor in the success and sustainability of this conference. We would also like to thank the Center for Health Promotion and Disease Prevention, who is a sponsor at the Tar Heel level. We hope that you all will take what you learned today and apply it to your own endeavors and how you choose to practice health as a human right. Our goal was for this to be a day of thoughtful engagement, new relationships, and reviving hope in the future of public health for each of you. In the coming days, you will receive a conference evaluation. Please be sure to complete the survey at your earliest convenience. Your feedback helps us to put on an effective conference every year. Also, if you're interested in contributing to the conference in any way, please reach out to us at minorityhealthconference@unc.edu. Planning for next year's conference is right around the corner. We hope to see you all next year.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, we can see yourself. It's really weird. I think